Well, hello again. Welcome to Horror in Detail. Today we are going to share Wendigo and Cryptids encounter stories. First story. This story was shared by u/Togiak, so credits to him. Terrifying Wendigo encounter during remote border crossing. We've got crows back at home. In my town we see them every day. Sometimes solo, sometimes in a group. I am well aware that a group of crows is referred to as a murder, but despite this ominous label, they're pretty shy and generally fly away at the first sign of danger. But the pair of big black birds circling the point across the lake were something else entirely. I know that around the Canadian border ravens become more common than crows, and this is what I suppose they were. But these were really big, too big, possibly bigger than an eagle. And as they circled the point, the calls they made were unnerving. Nothing like the caw of a crow, the sounds were screeching drawn-out croaks, as though to make sure that every creature on the lake was aware of their presence. I kept quiet from my vantage point 200 yards across the bay, and the travelers I had in my charge knew enough to keep still and silent. We were 3/4 done with our journey that had begun at a clandestine location outside of Atikokan. I never thought I could become a smuggler, but here I was, tucked under ancient white pines with a man and woman who were essentially strangers to me. They watched the huge birds with me, whispering back and forth in their native language. I don't know what they were saying, but the look in their eyes showed their fear. And these people have seen things in their homeland bad enough for them to leave with nothing more than a few possessions, and then give all of their money to a stranger who arranged for me to take them through the wilderness to cross the most remote section of the largest unguarded border in the world. Traveling by canoe along a route that my ancestors have traveled since long before there was a border, we had crossed the imaginary line last night, and by this time tomorrow I planned to load them into a van that would be waiting at a trailhead near Ely. This was where we would part ways. For now we were preparing to break camp at a campsite known only to me. I carved it out of the timber a few years ago, and it is able to conceal not only a tent but a canoe as well. There's not much canoe traffic this time of year, but I was doing a final check to make sure the coast was clear when the birds showed up. Figuring there must be something along the shore holding their interest, I fished my binoculars out of my pack to get a closer look at the sinister pair. To the naked eye it looked like a typical rocky point on a shield lake. A smooth rock shoreline gave way to a stand of sparse bulrushes with a couple of boulders. One of the boulders didn't look right. I realized that I was actually looking at a dead moose that had floated up there. Likely a casualty from the moose season that ended the week before. That explained why the pair of birds were circling, and I pulled the binoculars away to study how the birds were behaving. They took turns swooping down low over the moose and then soaring higher than the treetops and letting out their disturbing calls. Then there was movement in the trees. I pulled the binoculars back up and focused in on the mix of birch and fir that was along the shoreline. At first I thought it was a bear, coming down to take advantage of the dead moose. But this was far taller than a bear. Then I saw the antlers. Some smaller trees parted and then what at first I thought was a moose stepped to the water's edge. I've seen hundreds of moose in my time up here, but what I was seeing now didn't make sense. Sure, it had antlers, and it was tall like a moose. But it was mostly without fur, and the color was all wrong, more of a sickly pinkish gray than the dark brown you would expect of a moose. I could see its ribs. And its front legs weren't really legs, they were more like long, gangly arms. Arms that ended in long bony fingers. Even though I was about 200 yards away I could see the glint of fangs. It stepped from the trees to the water's edge. It paused and looked up at the circling birds. It let out a scream that hung in the air. One of my travelers let out a whimper, and I put a raised finger across my lips. I knew we were out of sight of what any typical animal or person could see, but this was far from typical. I flashed back to many years before when I stared wide-eyed at my grandfather as he told stories around the campfire. Flames flickered and birch logs crackled as he described an evil spirit called the Wendigo. Many generations ago a lost hunter turned to cannibalism to survive, and his evil deed transformed him into a horrific beast. A beast that roamed the wilds with an insatiable hunger for flesh, human or otherwise. While this story terrified me as a child, I never gave it any thought as an adult, as the elders had many tales of spirits and such. But here I was, miles from the nearest road, two strangers in my care, looking at the impossible. I subconsciously reached to feel the outline of my revolver tucked into the back of my pants. The beast had now waded into the water and its claws began tearing at the moose carcass. It ripped off huge chunks of flesh, hide, and bone with ease, shoving them into his gaping mouth where they were crunched and swallowed. The water around the moose carcass was soon tinged red with blood and a pair of giant birds took roost in a tall pine above the beast. The carnage continued as the creature consumed impossible amounts in minutes. I heard one of the travelers whisper, "Monstro." I didn't need translation to know what it meant. They had every reason to be scared now. I've had face-to-face standoffs with wild bears, with big city gangs, with angry fathers. At least with those you have an idea of what you are dealing with. My grandfather never said how one would deal with a Wendigo. With most of the moose consumed, the monster let out another scream. I was back to looking through binoculars, which was a mistake as the beast's face and chest were covered in blood, and flesh clung to its claws. An image I will never be able to erase. Despite having consumed the better part of an adult moose, it was still gaunt in appearance. It took a last look around and I stopped breathing when its gaze seemed to focus on our location for a moment. It slowly turned towards shore and then disappeared into the brush. This cued the black birds to come down for what was left. One bird rested on the moose's hindquarter and picked away at intestines, the other rested on the head and feasted on the eyes and torn open neck. After a few minutes they flew up silently, circled over our location and then headed in the general direction the Wendigo had gone. At least they went in the opposite direction we were headed. We sat in silence for a time, then I pulled out a map. I showed the travelers where we were, where the Wendigo had gone, and where we needed to go to complete the journey. I showed them my gun, which I had kept hidden from them until now, hoping it would ease their fears. It didn't do much to ease my fears. It was a .357 revolver, enough to stop a bear, but what would it do to a Wendigo? I suspected there needed to be some version of a silver bullet to stop an evil spirit. I gestured to them to pack their belongings, which they did quickly and quietly. I calculated that if we traveled lightly and quickly we could be out by nightfall. I decided to leave the tent and everything else not essential. We slid the canoe down the bank, climbed in and pushed off. The woman sat on the floor in the middle, the man was at the bow. I paddled from the stern with intensity. We had about 10 miles to the end of the lake. At the end of the lake was a portage trail of about a half-mile that would bring us to the next lake. We had done a number of portages already on this trip, and after the morning's events I was dreading having to be on foot. There was no other way out. A light wind was at our back, allowing for relatively quick travel. The man was paddling as best he could, but it was marginally helpful at best. The woman kept her head down and did not move. Usually on this kind of trip I try to hug the shoreline to keep a low profile, but now we were tracking right down the middle of the lake. I was making a beeline for a height of land where I knew the portage was, and we continued along in silence. The paddle down the long lake was uneventful, and it was early afternoon when we reached the portage. Once ashore we took a short break and ate some jerky, and then it was time to make the portage. It would be easier now since I had abandoned most of the gear. On earlier portages I had the travelers hide out while I scouted ahead to make sure we would not meet anyone on the trail, but there was no time for that. I think they understood me as I tried to explain the importance of moving quickly and quietly. I pointed to the trail and then to the packs and paddles. They took the cue and I put the canoe up on my shoulders and we plodded along through the forest. It took less than an hour to get to the next lake. There was a forest fire here several years before, and the charred remains of a few old-growth pines stood in stark contrast to the young aspen, birch and spruce that had grown in the void left by the fire. This lake was smaller, with many bays and points, and we were soon back to making progress in the canoe. Wendigo that we came around a point midway down the lake. I looked to the end of the lake where we would find the next portage and stopped padding. Maybe 300 yards away was the remains of a burnt pine. Roosting in the tree were two birds. Big, black birds. The man in the bow saw them too, and muttered something to the woman. She looked up for the first time and stifled a scream. We had to go past them to get to the next portage, so I kept paddling down the middle, not taking my eyes off the birds. As we got closer it was obvious they were watching us too, their heads pivoting as we passed them. I kept looking back over my shoulder at them, but they held their position. I didn't know what the presence of the birds on our route signified, but based on what I saw this morning it couldn't be good. By the time we were at the end of lake where the next portage was, I could barely make out the tree anymore. I thought that perhaps we were in the clear, but then we all heard the unmistakable sound, the same sound we heard the birds making this morning. Even though they had to be over a mile away there was no mistaking it. The long, drawn-out croaking continued for a minute, then it was silent again. I paddled towards shore so hard that the bow slid 2 feet onto the bank. Go! 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 I yelled. The travelers seemed shocked at my yelling, as I had not said anything to them in the few days we had been together that wasn't a whisper. They both scrambled out of the canoe, grabbed the gear and headed up the path. I again wrestled the canoe onto my shoulders and followed. We still had another lake to cross after this portage, then it was down a creek to where we were to be picked up in a remote parking lot at the end of a forest road. We would be early, but maybe I could get a cell phone signal and get a call or text to the driver. Or maybe we could hitch a ride with a tourist. Any concerns of being intercepted by authorities has now taken a back seat to getting out of here and away from that thing that for all I knew was making its way south toward us. Since we were closer to an access point, this mile-long portage was well traveled and we made good time. The first half was up a slight incline, then it went down much more steeply to the next lake. We reached the top, and paused for a quick rest. I set the canoe down to catch my breath. The crest of the trail allowed a good view of the valley ahead. It also allowed a good view of two huge, black birds that were circling above the tree tops. The woman was not able to stifle her scream this time, and this prompted the birds to start up with their ominous calls. In the distance we heard another sound. It was a scream that could have only come from the horror we had seen this morning. While I felt a certain amount of responsibility to the travelers, my concern for them was waning. "You better keep up," I yelled as hoisted the canoe back onto my shoulders. I headed down the steep trail as fast as I could, and I could hear the travelers behind me, stumbling, but not falling too far behind. With the canoe on my shoulders I couldn't see if they were carrying the paddles. Didn't matter, I keep a spare strapped to the supports in the canoe. The steep path made a switchback and was able to see that the man was indeed carrying a paddle and pack. The woman was crying hysterically, carrying nothing. The path here was steep and rough, with many large rocks and roots creating potential tripping hazards. The birds were circling overhead us now, their croaks echoing off the hillside. We heard the distant scream again, although this time it didn't sound so distant. It was not possible for us to move any faster, but I took care to be sure-footed. I could see we were nearly to the bottom of the hill. Once there it would be level ground to the next lake, which was now only a few hundred yards away. I made it to the bottom of the hill where the well-worn path went through a series of large roots and then turned to dirt. Once to the dirt I flipped the canoe off my shoulders and let it land on the hull. The travelers were coming up 50 yards behind me. I grabbed the bow of the canoe and started dragging it, hoping the man would catch up and grab the stern. I started to yell at the couple to hurry, but I was interrupted by another scream from the beast. It was coming from our right and I could now hear branches breaking and what sounded like breathing and snarling. There was no reason to think that the lake would offer refuge from this thing, but it seemed like a better option than facing it here on the path. The man was almost caught up to me, but he stopped to see where his partner was. She had tripped on a root and was now screaming, not sure if it was in pain or terror. Probably more terror, as the Wendigo had broken through the brush along the trail and was now 50 feet behind her. She looked back at it and let out what she meant to be a scream but came out as a yelp. The beast was on her in seconds, and it picked her up over its head and slammed her to the ground. The man dropped to his knees, watching in horror as his partner was torn apart and devoured. Wendigo resumed dragging the canoe as fast as I could, not looking back. The beast let out another shriek, then there was a scream that I presumed to be from the man. I tried not to think about the snapping and crunching sounds I could hear from behind me. The next lake was now in sight, and even though my entire body wanted to quit, I was now running. The shoreline was sandy and I ran right into the water, allowing the canoe to float past me. I hopped in when the back seat was even with me, and in one motion pulled the tag end of the knot that held my spare paddle in place. A few quick strokes and I was 20 yards from shore. The screams of the beast continued, and the black birds that had been watching the bloodbath from treetops now were starting to swoop around me, getting closer with each pass. The Wendigo was now on the shoreline and it let out the loudest scream of all. It stepped in the water to its knees but stopped, gesturing with its long arms and howling at the sky. Not knowing what to do next, I pulled out my revolver. At the end of this lake was the outlet stream that would lead me to a bridge. For the moment I felt safer where I was. The birds were getting ever bolder, and I could feel the wind as one of them swooped in on me from behind my shoulder. It wheeled around over the bow and came right back at me. It reared back at arm's length with its wings spread and its talons coming right at my face. Taking advantage of a perfect opportunity, one pointed the gun barrel at the bird's center and pulled the trigger. Black feathers flew and the now silenced bird landed in the water and strangely sank out of sight. The other bird flew up high and then quickly descended, coming right at me. I had the gun raised, but the bird did not offer a good target and it flew past my head. Sensing weakness, it circled around and attacked, pecking me on the back of the head with its massive beak. I had to be careful not to tip as I tried to fend it off with the paddle. More determined than ever, the bird came back at me. I fired twice, missing both times. With 3 rounds left in the gun, I knew I better choose my next shots carefully. The bird came from behind me again, this time it wheeled around quickly, planting its talons on my chest and pecking at my eyes. My attempts to fend it off with a fist were not successful and it got a hold of my eyebrow. I could feel flesh pulling away from my skull, and I pointed the gun right at it, and even though I thought the barrel was pressed right into it, I still missed. I resorted to using the gun as a bludgeon that I slammed into its neck. This had a noticeable effect. It let out a deep croak and let go its grip. I was not watching the Wendigo at this point, focused on the dark feathered assailant. I could hear it though, as it let out shrieks and screams louder than a siren. The remaining black bird, shook up some from the pistol whipping, flew in a crooked path now, obviously having difficulty maintaining its course. I felt confident I could take it down with one of my remaining rounds. It came straight at me. I let it peck the top of my head as it went by. It circled around again, and once more I let it get me with a good peck to my temple. It made another loop around, and I was ready when it followed the same path of attack. It came right at me, and I was looking down the barrel right at the bird's head when I pulled the trigger. The raven's head disintegrated in a cloud of black feathers and blood, and the headless body landed at my feet, wings still flapping, talons still grasping. The shrieks of the Wendigo suddenly stopped. It stood motionless, staring out at the lake, not necessarily at me. I set the gun on the seat next to me. There was still one round left. I used the paddle as a shovel to lift the dead bird over the side and into the lake, where it too strangely sank out of sight. The Wendigo, while still a fearsome-looking beast with its face and claws covered in blood and flesh, had lost its menacing posture. I pointed the revolver at it, right at its head. I was confident I could hit it, not confident that my one remaining bullet would kill it. For some reason I thought about the old saying, that if carrying a handgun for bear protection you should save the last round for yourself. Pretty sure the old saying applies here. I lowered the gun and watched the beast. With its long bony arms hanging at its sides it turned towards shore, and with 2 big steps it was crashing through the timber, heading away from the lake, away from me, away from my exit point. I sat quietly for a minute, trying to take all of this in. I could no longer hear the sounds of branches breaking. Was the Wendigo gone? Apparently they can't, or won't swim. The ravens must act as seers or scouts for the Wendigo. Once they were eliminated it was like a switch was flipped. I thought about the hapless travelers. I knew it was pointless to go back to where I had last seen them. What would happen to me when I left the lake? It was now late in the afternoon. I slid the revolver with its 1 bullet into the back of my jeans, picked up the paddle and headed for the outlet creek. Second story. This story was shared by you/the poet soldier, so credits to him. My name is Hattie, and I am an only child. Jesus, I hope this doesn't get turned into a TikTok with Subway Surfers content playing in the background. I can't imagine what would happen if one of these things saw this through their social media feed and reset me. I apologize, but I don't really know how to start one of these things off. Everyone here seems to be so certain of themselves when talking about their horrific experiences here, and I've typed up 7 separate options for the introduction and discarded all of them. What am I even supposed to say? Am I to blame for not believing murderous cryptids when they tell me I'm their sibling? The thing is, I wasn't always an only child. Years before the things found me, I had a brother and sister. They were twins, and always at each other's throats. I was the youngest by 9 years, and found myself caught in the crossfire between the 2 of them more often than not. They went off to college when I was 6 due to some sort of early graduation program. My mom was in despair after they left. She had always felt closer to the 2 of them, as they had been closer in age to her and enjoyed writing as much as she did. I guess having a math nerd as a child when you're a famous author is disappointing. If my dad was upset, he didn't show it. He's a traditional man, and thinks that he's responsible for providing for the family even though my mom makes more than enough for all 5 of us. He's constantly on trips, and so the two of us never grew close. My relationship with them got worse after the accident. I had blown up at both of my siblings because 11-year-old me didn't think she was getting enough attention from our family. They tried to push it off at first, claiming that I was just being the attention-seeking youngest. And then I stopped talking. It wasn't a silent treatment, but that's what they saw it as. For some reason, I had become mute, or nonverbal. I have no idea how to distinguish one from another without a doctor's diagnosis, sometime after the argument. My parents brushed it off for a few days, but when school continued and I still wasn't speaking, they grew concerned. They had my siblings come home, and told me that we would all talk it out and spend some time together. My parents had grown frustrated when I didn't speak even when they came home, and told my siblings to leave as to not encourage me further. For probably the first time in their lives, they agreed on something. My sister's car broke down, and so they both took my brother's car back to the college. We learned that they died about 5 hours later. They apparently both stopped to get some drinks in order to de-stress after the argument, and had gotten into an accident not a mile from the bar. My parents never admitted to blaming me, but they didn't try to hide how they felt either. My mom hit a writer's block soon after that, which my dad used as an excuse to go on business trips. We all knew he just wanted to get away from Kate and Neil's ghosts. But my family trauma isn't what I'm here to discuss. This all had to do with the phone call I got a year ago. I was about to turn 16 at the time, and had assumed that the phone call I received was a birthday call from some distant family member that had taken pity on me. My siblings sang happy birthday to me for the first time. I panicked, before realizing that someone from my school likely programmed AI voices to creep me out, as I wasn't exactly well liked. I was pissed off, though, and decided to snap at them. I don't know who the hell you are, but if you think that this is going to upset me, you're wrong. Your shitty AI doesn't quite capture their pretentious tones. And if this is Maddie on the other end of the line, I hope that you also receive the pleasure of having your asshole siblings die, I snapped. I know now how absolutely pitiful it sounds, but I was still in shock from hearing their voices and could hardly keep my voice from shaking. Instead of whoever it was on the other end of the line laughing, or hanging up, they bickered amongst themselves. Their voices initially sounded like my siblings, but abruptly changed to two very different sounding people. I was only able to make out a few phrases, but I'll record them here anyways in case I'm reset. They could just be saying that to make us hang up. It should have charmed her. You can try tomorrow. Forget. Just reset her. She isn't ready for that. Fine. Wait. Give, Dad. I was very close to hanging up when I heard my dad's voice. I was suspicious of this being yet another AI at first, but he comforted me and told me that there were kids playing around with the technology at his job. They had, apparently, heard that it was my birthday and decided to use the first voices in his phone to surprise me, unknowing of the damage they had caused. It still didn't explain why they had called him Dad. Unless, of course, he had a long-standing affair with another woman. I didn't care enough to do anything about it, but I did wonder if that would be enough to get the two of them to finally divorce with one another. Do you know these kids? I asked, attempting to keep my tone light. I knew that he wasn't going to confess, but wanted to mess with him anyway. I was, as many rising freshmen are, very spiteful. My dad, unsurprisingly, hesitated. They are some close family members. I do hope you can forgive them. They're hoping to see you soon, you know, I've told them all about you. I was thinking that we could all five go to that new library they've just built. The two of them are real book nerds, just like you, he said, laughing. I sat there, absolutely dumbfounded for a moment. There was no way that he had the gall to do something like that if those kids were my half-siblings. Looking forward to it, I said, before hanging up. Everything about that conversation felt unnatural, but I didn't feel like looking into it too much. My dad and mom could deal with each other. I'd already done enough to improve the quality of our family dynamic. I didn't realize that I had spoken. It felt so natural, and I remember my voice being completely clear, as if I had never stopped speaking at all. I believe that this was my first mistake, but knowing these things I could have messed up long before it. I decided to go to sleep. As my dad had promised that he would be home the next morning and my mom was fussing over her latest project. Apparently, a burst of inspiration had struck her a few hours ago, which I wasn't about to discourage. Hopefully it would tone down her moping. Not being concerned when my alarm clock didn't work the next morning may have been my second mistake, because when I came downstairs at 10:00 my dad was sitting at the table with two teenagers. Two twin boys, one with slicked back hair and calculating eyes and the other who looked like he hadn't brushed his hair in years. I decided to head back upstairs, as I could only assume that this all had something to do with my dad's work in some way. I hadn't gotten 3 steps up the stairs when he called me downstairs. I sighed and entered the room. Apparently, him not ignoring me wasn't a one-time thing. This was going to be a pain to deal with. I looked at the two boys with suspicion. They did not seem old enough to be working with my father. "Oh, Hattie. I should have introduced you to these two. These are your cousins, William and Arlo." The more serious-looking cousin smiled coolly, and clarified that he was Arlo. William sat by him, happily swinging his feet like some sort of overstimulated toddler. I looked at the two of them, deciding on whether or not I wanted to mess with my dad despite the kindness he had been showing this past day. A day doesn't make up for 15 years, I decided, and dug my heels into this conversation. Hopefully I could get the two of them out of here before lunch. "Dad, I don't remember you mentioning any cousins to me," I said, giving him a shit-eating grin. I wasn't sure if the two of them were in on whatever he was doing, but I became more sure that they were when they exchanged a nervous glance with one another. My dad looked at me, perplexed. "Of course you remember them. I used to tell you about them all the time. They just couldn't afford to visit us then and your mother didn't like to travel. Don't you remember calling them all of the time? You thought that they were the coolest people in the world, even though they were only 3 years older than you," he said. I paused for a moment, wondering if he was aware of the bullshit he was currently spewing out. "It was Neil that didn't like to travel," I said. I saw the two cousins flinch. That seemed less suspicious to me, as they likely knew now that they had accidentally prank-called me using the voices of my dead siblings. "Neil?" my dad asked, seeming perplexed. I was just about to snap at him for not remembering something so crucial about one of his children when Arlo grabbed me by the wrist. "Don't you have to be at work?" he asked my dad. "I know Hattie has a day off of school, but your work started an hour ago. You should hurry and leave." I don't know what happened to my dad in that moment, but he seemed to look far too afraid for a man who was only late for look. He practically sprinted out of the door, before William called out to him. "Not going to say goodbye to your favorite daughter?" he asked with an easy smile. My dad spun around, wishing me well and hugging me for the first time in years. He glanced at my cousin, who nodded, before leaving. Arlo's hand was back on my wrist. It must have let go when I was hugging my dad. He squeezed his hand. I wasn't sure if it was supposed to be comforting or not, but William's smile put me at ease. "I'm surprised that you don't remember us at all, Hattie. "We just slept over at your house a few weeks ago, remember?" he asked, his hold on my hand becoming more forceful. I wasn't sure why he was doing it, but it made me uneasy enough that I nodded my head in agreement despite the fact that I had never seen this kid before. "I'm sorry. My memory tends to be a bit fuzzy since everything happened with my siblings." "I think I remember you guys now," I said, smiling sheepishly. William seemed overjoyed with this response, and Arlo loosened the pressure on my wrist. I allowed myself to relax a little bit. My family were never big travelers with how Neil was in planes. Maybe people where they were often expressed themselves like this. I didn't like the way his finger rested over the veins of my wrist, as if he was checking my pulse. It was making me feel dizzy. I shook myself out of the suspicion. Maybe it was a tradition where they were from, and I was being a xenophobic asshole. Arlo studied my expression. I tried to school it into something more neutral. "I didn't think you had siblings, Hattie," he said, his voice oddly melodic. I felt a sensation of calm run through my body, though I'm not sure why. I relaxed and gave him a smile. "Oh. My apologies, you're right," I said before I had realized the words I had spoken. I went to correct myself and clarify that I did have siblings, and that they just happened to be underground, but decided against it. Who cared about Neil and my other brother? Yes, right, I had two brothers who passed, Neil and Wilbur. I felt a pang of guilt for forgetting about them so easily. William gave me a reassuring smile before telling Arlo to release my wrist. He did, surprisingly, and my thoughts became more distinct. The shithead was probably cutting off my circulation. My ears began to ring. Was that a symptom of bad circulation? I wasn't sure. I had never been interested in science. I was far more inclined to writing. "Do we have her, Arlo?" he asked softly. Arlo nodded with a satisfied hum, which made William's never-ending smile brighten even more. I wished that I could be on whatever this guy was. He seemed like a little ball of sunshine despite the fact that he was easily 17. They were more difficult than the others. The parents were too distant from their child to reform them as a unit. "We'll have to take more care when processing her if we want to keep her mind open to future transfers," Arlo said, looking at me as if I was some sort of specimen that a child had pinned to their bug collection project. I shifted under the weight of his gaze. "Sorry, I'm not following this conversation. If this is a personal conversation, I can give you guys some privacy," I offered, hoping to get out of the room as politely as possible. If my dad was willing to be so kind to me just to prove something to these cousins, I could only imagine what would happen if I severed relationships with them. William let out an audible gasp, before steeling himself. Arlo took a step closer to me. Definitely not the right choice on my behalf. Fuck, I thought, praying that I could salvage the situation. "Sorry, I didn't mean to be rude. I just didn't want to intrude on your conversation if it was," I started to say, before William interrupted me. He looked like I had kicked his puppy. "I thought you couldn't hear us," he muttered, his smile fading. I shook my head. "Oh, my ears were ringing if that's what you meant. But I feel fine. If you need me to go, then." I could feel the room darkening around me. I heard William call out to Arlo, who only acknowledged him with a distant hum. I didn't realize that I was falling until a pair of arms caught me, holding me with all of the care of a vivo tester. I tried to open my eyes, and was met with two glowing lights shaped oddly like eyes. I was surely hallucinating. My desire to stay awake faded with this revelation. My brothers would surely take me to the hospital. I resigned myself to unconsciousness. Not being concerned when my alarm clock didn't work the next morning must have been a mistake, because when I came downstairs at 10:00 my dad was sitting at the table with two teenagers. Two twin boys, one with slicked back hair and calculating eyes and the other who looked like he hadn't groomed himself in years. I decided to head back upstairs, as I could only assume that this all had something to do with my dad's work in some way. I hadn't gotten 3 steps up the stairs when he called me downstairs. I sighed and entered the room. Apparently, him not ignoring me wasn't a one-time thing. This was going to be a pain to deal with. I looked at the two boys with suspicion. They did not seem old enough to be working with my father. "Aren't you going to say hello to your brothers?" he asked me, and I looked over to the two boys sitting up at the counter. I had never seen them before, and was unsure of what my father was hinting at. I waved at the two of them shyly, and became even more confused when the look on both of their faces brightened significantly, as if I was some sort of celebrity. "Sorry, do I know you too?" I asked, trying to recall where I may have seen the two of them before. I felt something on the edge of my memory, but I couldn't quite grasp it. If I had seen them before, it wasn't recent. My dad laughed. He hadn't done that in years. "You and your practical jokes, Hattie. I have to head off to work, but I'll see you 3 later," he said, ruffling William's hair before walking out of the door. The air became noticeably colder when the garage door shut. "William," Arlo said, sounding perplexed. William looked at him and nodded, though he didn't seem happy. I hoped that I hadn't offended him. "You're a pretty tough one, aren't you?" Arlo asked, grabbing my wrist. I recoiled without thinking, unsure of what I had done wrong. He looked infuriated. "I'm sorry," I asked, intending for it to sound like an apology but instead turning it into a question. William sighed. I think that I noticed how absolutely fucked I was when the stranger placed his finger over my wrist, feeling my pulse. Someone had done it before, and though I wasn't sure who it was, I knew that it wasn't a particularly safe person. "She isn't aware, but she didn't set it up correctly," Arlo muttered. "I guess we ought to reset again." He looked cold and cruel. So much so that I tried to withdraw my hand. A wave of dizziness hit me upon the attempt, and the darkness clouding my vision gave me a terrible feeling of déjà vu. 2 red lights, and this time I was not unwell enough to doubt what I was seeing. Arlo looked sickly. Inhumanly so. I tried to right myself in order to help my brother. "She seems to be accepting it," William commented, seemingly oddly optimistic for a person whose twin had turned a sickly pale shade, his eyes glowing. "Not enough," Arlo said stubbornly, causing William to laugh. Arlo smiled. A liquid that I could only assume to be blood coated his all-too-sharp teeth. Something was wrong with my brother, and I wasn't sure if I should help him or run. I looked around, unsure of what to do, and caught something odd in my peripheral vision. My hands were coated in blood. It was so clotted that instead of dripping off of my hands it fell off in clumsy chunks onto the kitchen floor. I tried to scream and found myself unable to make noise. Was I awake? "Quit taunting the child, Arlo," William said sternly, and the blood faded. Arlo looked healthier too, much to my relief. Needed to scare her before I reset. It speeds things up. "I learned from the best," he said, grinning cockily. Not being concerned when my alarm clock didn't work the next morning was likely the best thing that could have happened to me. I looked down at my hands, which were pristine. Too pristine, in fact. I could feel the phantom feeling of warm, thick liquid coating it. Blood. I shook my head. I was being dramatic, a right reserved to my mother and her books. I had never been one to write or read. Why had my dad called me a book nerd, then? I felt my fear before I understood it. I didn't like books, and I didn't read. I was a calculated mathematician, taking Calculus 2 in the 10th grade despite the fact that I was nearly failing my on-level English class. My dad hadn't tried to get me into reading since my siblings had died. I heard voices downstairs. Two young teens, about the same age as my siblings had been when the accident had happened. The accident. I didn't have siblings, a fact which felt unnatural to me. I wasn't sure what was going on, but my gut was telling me that going downstairs was not a good idea. I didn't understand until I heard William tell my dad that he was going to wake up his sister. I remember, now. It hit me when I was pretending to be asleep, acting content enough to make that poor bastard's spineless self hesitate before leaving the room. I nearly screamed, and ended up turning around, in my sleep, because I couldn't bear to be facing away from Arlo's brother. I was glad that Arlo hadn't waken me up. If that freak had checked me for my pulse, he would have known that I was not only awake, but aware of what he was. I don't know how long I have until they come up here to wake me up again. I do not know how time works with these things works, but I hope that I will be able to regain my memories. Third story. This story was shared by u/Mabifthais, so credits to him. I'm an animal control expert who specializes in cryptids. One cryptid is entering human homes more often than usual. This is a PSA. For years I was the guy to call if you had a squirrel in your attic. I mean, to a lot of people I'm still that guy, but over the last 20 years I've branched out to other less common infestations. Now I'm the guy you call if there is a haunted doll rummaging through your attic or a Sasquatch trampling your flower beds. I love my job. The specializations I've acquired have allowed me to travel across the country, meet incredible people and experience cryptids like few have ever done before. It doesn't hurt that the pay is great, but the stories are even better. I have one short story for you now. It's more of a public service announcement than anything else really. I've dealt with every sort of infestation from Sasquatches, spray human urine around area of sighting and it will avoid the area, demonic presences, usually need to bring a priest in. Sometimes can be tricked into inhabiting a lesser creature, like a frog, and jackalopes, it's just a bunny with some antlers. Put it in a cage and give the poor thing a carrot. But recently there has been one cryptid that has been growing more and more invasive into human settlements, the hide-behind. Most commonly found in the forests of the northern United States and Canada, the hide-behind is one cryptid that cannot easily be dealt with. In fact, I'm not sure it's even possible for one of these to be bagged and tagged like we normally would with other cryptids. To my knowledge, no hide-behind has ever been killed, maimed, dazed, or even simply removed from a residence. Once it has made a claim to an area, whether it be a local forest, a cave, or even, in one particularly bloody case, a Bass Pro shop, it will defend that area to the death. First documented by the Native Americans, then by lumberjacks in the PNW of America, the hide-behind is one of the lesser known, but cryptids on the continent, but without a doubt, one of the most dangerous. No one really knows what they look like. As the name suggests, as soon as they are seen they quickly duck out of view to hide behind anything in the vicinity. In the wild, this would be trees and rocks. In your home this could be a corner, a kitchen cabinet, a television, or literally anything else, as they can manipulate their body to hide behind an object of any size. In the few accounts of the sightings we have on record, they have been described as everything from a large bear/lion hybrid to a frail and elderly woman with long arms and rashes on her skin. Because of this wide discrepancy in their descriptions, they are believed to be shapeshifters that can change their shape based on what they believe will best get their potential victim to come closer and investigate the sighting. I don't know why the hide-behinds are moving into suburbs. I'd guess destruction of their natural habitat, but it is becoming a real problem. That's why I am going to share this story with you now, so you know what to do if one shows up in your home. I pulled up to Tim's house around 12 p.m. on a Tuesday. He had called in to tell us there was a demonic entity in his house and we needed to remove it ASAP. They always demand ASAP. Tim had nothing going on, but people are so much more demanding than they were 20 years ago. I took a quick look around the house and it was pretty apparent there wasn't any sort of demon in his residence. Not only was there no reaction to the holy water and Ouija board I had brought with me, but Tim also didn't have normal symptoms of a demonic haunting, bad dreams, sleep paralysis, or the witnessing of any telekinetic events. After further questioning, he described what he had seen in more detail. First, I was sitting right there on the couch watching television when I got the feeling I was being watched. I turned my attention to the screen door and for just a second I saw a bear looking in through the screen, but it wasn't a bear, you see. A bear would just keep on staring at me or keep poking at the door, but this thing just ducked out of view as quick as can be, like it was trying to sneak up on me and I had caught it in the act. It bothered me something awful, but I just grabbed my gun, set it on my lap and kept on watching the TV, and eventually that feeling, like I was being watched, just kinda melted off. It was all peaches and cream until she showed up a few days later. The she Tim was referring to was a new, human form that the hide-behind was taking. I assume it was because of the lack of a reaction to the bear form it had previously shown itself as. Like I said earlier, the hide-behind wants you to look for it, to come nearer, like the angler fish. It dangles something in front of you in an attempt to bring you closer. It's a lazy hunter. I was out in the garage in my workshop and that feeling come over me again, that being watched feeling. I turn around and I'm looking out the garage door and I don't see nothing, but then out of nowhere I see a lady's head and shoulder pop out from the corner of the garage, and the second she sees me eyeing her she pops right back around the corner where she came from. Well, this time, I went looking round for her. I gave a wide berth around the corner, 'cause I lived in New York City for a year in the 70s, so I've seen crazy people and she looked crazy and I didn't want her grabbing me. So, I gave a wide berth around that corner and there wasn't no one there. I walked all around the house and I didn't see anyone. Not even footprints. Tell me that ain't demonic. It wasn't demonic. It was a hide-behind and I told the man as such. I told him living out here on the edge of town made him an easy target for it. I told him that there really isn't any way to get rid of them or scare them off. I told him he could try to leave his house for a year at minimum and maybe, with luck it would leave on its own, but the best bet would be for him to burn the place down and never come back. He didn't like that answer. My family lived in this house for 3 generations. I ain't leaving and I sure as hell ain't burning nothing down. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'll keep my shotgun on me and when I get that feeling again, I'll shoot it. Works for bears, and that's the meanest thing round these parts. Don't see why it wouldn't work for this, what did you call it, hide-behind. You can't argue with anyone over the age of 65, people get set in their ways, their beliefs calcify, so instead I was honest with him. I told him 2 things. The first thing I told him was that eventually he'd get that feeling that he was being watched and he'd get his gun and he'd start looking around for the hide-behind, only he wouldn't find it. That's what happens in all these cases, because at that point, it found the best hiding spot it can possibly get, the only place you won't be able to lay eyes on it, even if you tried, directly behind you. And at that point, it's too late for you. The second thing I told him was that I'd be back in 2 days and more than likely he'd be dead. And then I left. 2 days later I pulled my van up Tim's driveway to find the screen door open and blowing in the wind. I didn't even need to cross the threshold of his house to find him. He was everywhere. On the floor, the ceiling, the walls. The smell was unbelievable. I poured some gasoline on the front porch and lit it with a match. The house was an inferno within 30 seconds. I got in my van and started to pull out of the driveway, and I took one last look at the house and then beyond it out into the tree line where I saw, for just a split second, a young boy before he quickly pulled back and disappeared behind a thin little tree. I was hundreds of miles away by lunchtime. I say all of this to tell you, if you ever think you might have a hide behind in your house or even in the area, leave. Burn the place down if you can, so new people don't move it. These things are like bears, if they know they can get food someplace they are just going to keep coming back. And if you get the feeling that you're being watched and you can't figure out why, call your loved ones, because it's standing directly behind you. Fourth story. This story was shared by you/123 Cree 806, so credits to him. The Wendigo is real. Hear me out, this isn't a fictional story. This is an experience I had when I was 11. A dream that still intrigues me to this day and has made me have a passion for proving the Wendigo. This is my story. I was up at my grandparents' cabin down in Arizona. Surrounding the cabin was a mix of desert landscape and lakes with pine trees surrounding. It was beautiful but strange. I would always take hikes by myself with a .22 caliber hunting rifle. I would start by hopping on the back of an ATV and finding a nice stream to hike up. It was always fun for me and I loved the peace and quiet. Yet, all of this beauty had something dark amidst it. It was night and I could hear the coyotes howling and the screech of mountain lions in the night. I was sitting on the porch in a rocking chair brandishing my .22 caliber. I was tired and laid it down. I started to just rock in the chair. I didn't want to fall asleep outside, so I went back in and plopped myself on the couch. I began to doze off. A dream was awaiting me. I was in the rocking chair again. I just kept rocking and wouldn't move an inch. All I did was stare into the darkness that lay in front of me. There was a sound in the woods. I could hear the crunching of sticks. The sound only grew closer and closer. A misty fog started to seep onto the porch. I felt paralyzed, unable to move a single muscle. I was frightened at this point. I could now make out a loud breathing and grunting. Then I saw it. Staring at me on 2 feet was a thing that looked like a deer decaying. Its skull was exposed and it had what looked like moss hanging from the antlers. Its whole body was rotten and I could feel its breath on me. Then I woke up. After years went by I would have that dream come back and back to me. I felt like there was something more to it. Usually, we brush bad dreams aside, yet this again seemed like more than a bad dream. One day I was watching YouTube and I saw a video. It was called Cabin Fever. I was in shock when a drawing came up of what I saw in that dream. I learned of its name, the Wendigo. Never before had I heard of it or seen anything of the like. Still to this day I search for more answers. Sometimes I even have the same recurring dream. I feel like I am persuaded to find the truth about whatever the Wendigo is. I almost feel as if I am connected in some way to it. Maybe I am crazy or something, but I just will always feel like there was more to this. Fifth story. This story was shared by you/RevolutionaryWin6923, so credits to him. If I encountered a Wendigo, so I'll love to hear what you think. Before I tell the story, I wanted to give some background on the area and me. Feel free to skip. This took place in northern Alberta, Canada, and in Treaty 8 territory. I'm Woodland Cree and grew up in the area, so I heard many stories about the area. Especially the ones about the Wendigo, like how one was killed and they cut off the head and buried it near the Gruard area, and the body near Whitefish. This is to prevent the body and head from reattaching and reviving the creature. Another story I heard is about how the entire area of Woodland is haunted by evil spirits, and I always felt creeped out when I visit that area. This all happened when me and my cousin were out courting, and this was around late September to early October. This means that the days got shorter, so it will almost be completely dark at 9. This was at Gruard, where the head was supposedly buried nearby. We started at I believe 6 p.m. This was the first time we hung out in person since the pandemic started. We stayed out till 9 or 10, so it was completely dark out, but we were going through the fields where we pretty much grew up playing in, going through the reserve, seeing the house where we spent so many good memories at. It was a refreshing time because COVID just brought my mood down a lot, so it was nice to have a break. There's this baseball field that we went through how many times without a problem. This time when we were about to go through the field again, it was completely dark. Only light we had was the headlights on the quad, but we were used to driving in the dark, so this didn't seem out of the ordinary to us. But this time it felt off, like I felt like something was watching us or stalking us, a gut feeling. I wasn't the only one who felt this. My cousin felt it and said, "Do you feel that feeling too?" And I said, "Yeah, I feel it," so we decided to turn around. On our way back, my cousin turned his head and looked behind us, and he immediately looked forward and sped up. When we were pretty far away, he said, "The reason I sped up is because I thought I saw something moving back there." After that we decided to call it a night and went back home. I honestly have no idea why we felt that, like it was out of nowhere. Like I said, supposedly the head was buried in that area, maybe that had to do with it. I would love to hear what you guys think. Was it Wendigo or something else? Thanks guys. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.